Yeah.
If there's no gradient, there's no movement. But if the gradient's too big, bigger reduction in force output. You see it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So powerlifting is like, how small can I make this gradient, still get enough movement, right, that I can still produce my maximum force.
Good morning. Happy Wednesday. I have Neuro Coffee in hand, and it is perfect. All right. Well, today is Wednesday, and that means that tomorrow is Thursday, and we will have the usual Coffee and Coaches Conference call at 6 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The link to that will be on my professional Facebook page at Bill Hartman PT. If you would like to join us, the group's been stellar. Questions have been awesome. We've been going long because they're so much fun. So please join us for that. If you would like to participate in a 15-minute consultation, please go to askbillhartman@gmail.com, askbillhartman@gmail.com. Put in the subject line 15-minute consultation so I do not delete it by accident, and we will try to get those set up for you as well. Okay, digging into today's Q&A. Wednesdays are always a little tight, so we got to go right into this. This is another Q&A that I did with Ben. Ben had a very popular call, I think it was last week actually, in regards to powerlifting, and so we sort of continued our little process, sticking with the topic of powerlifting. We talked a lot about what adaptations that we're actually expecting under the circumstances of increasing force production or gym strength, however you want to look at that. And so we talked about those, and then we talked about the potential secondary consequences that are associated with that, how we may lose motion, how that actually might be beneficial, and then what do we really consider these normative measures? Are there such thing as norms? So this is a really good call. I think we went like 23 minutes or so. So make sure you watch the whole thing through. If you don't want to watch it here, it'll be up on YouTube later. So please go to YouTube and subscribe. Excuse me. Please subscribe on YouTube, and then I will see you guys tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. on the Coffee and Coaches Conference call. I'll see you guys later.
Camera is rolling. Clock has started. Hey, Ben, you have the coveted last spot of the day.
Just like last week, I'm blessed.
Yeah. Well, here we go. Go ahead.
So last week we talked a lot about powerlifting, and I would like to continue in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
But just more from like a general perspective, it seems like powerlifting is this sport that requires you to a degree, depending on the person, to decrease movement options from the standpoint of this is something that's necessary for performance. We need to be able to compress A to P. And what really differentiates the lifters who can get to the highest levels is like, how much can you be able to compress without losing that relative motion or without experiencing these side effects?
Correct.
And so a lot of the powerlifters that I work with, it's different in every case, but a lot of them at some point will run into some issue, whether it's an elbow, a shoulder, a hip. It's always something. And so it becomes more a story of like, how can we best manage these things over the longest period of time without succumbing to worse, injuries and things like that. So my question more relates to the general scheme of like, it seems like we're sort of fighting this uphill battle. So presuming that we have things like eating, sleeping, load management, frequency management, all those things intact, what are some strategies as far as exercise selection goes that we can really take advantage of with powerlifters, assuming that, we are including a fair amount of this alternating, reciprocating work in our accessory programming, because it is helpful to a degree, but at a certain point, we are still trying to get strong. We are still trying to get bigger. And even using these alternating activities can become at a certain point, more compressive to the individual. So,
right. Okay. So first things first, in any endeavor that requires high speed, high force, you're going to see an influence that will reduce movement options because it makes things more efficient. So let me use a sprinter example. Okay. A sprinter makes ground contact for a very brief moment in time, very brief, less than a second, right? And the amount of internal rotation that they will demonstrate because of that by traditional measures, it doesn't mean that they're not internally rotating elsewhere. But if I was to say to look at a hip or something like that, they will have very, very little relative movement in the hip because the ground contact is so fast. They don't want a long excursion of internal rotation, because the longer the excursion of internal rotation, the longer they're on the ground and the slower they run. So it behooves them to create a shape of their body and an orientation and position of their body that provides them the greatest influence of force into the ground over the shortest time period. So anytime we're looking at performance-related adaptations, we are intentionally reducing adaptability. That's how you raise performance. People that have broad scope adaptability don't play sports. They're not good at anything. The people that are exceptional at things have what we would consider a reduced amount of adaptability somewhere in some way, shape, or form. Okay? Because of the extreme force output demands of powerlifting. The better you get at lifting heavy things, the more likely you are to lose your adaptability, because you're taking all of your so think about like just starting somebody from scratch. They have this broad scope of adaptability, and I need to take away as much of that as possible and filter it into one thing, which is absolute force production. So it is inevitable in most circumstances. There may be some outlier exceptions of guys that can still lift gigantic heavy weights and still move enough. But ultimately, your goal is to reduce that adaptability because it improves the efficiency in their performance of the sport. The more shoulder rotation I have available to me, the more shoulder rotation I have to control and then lift the weight. If I give up that movement, I don't have to try to control it. Now I can put more effort and energy into the lift itself, right? So let's say if I have 100 units of energy that I can put into a bench press, and one guy has to control more range of motion, so he has to take 30 units of that 100 to control the shoulder, and then he puts 70 into the bar. And another guy only has to control with 15 units of energy to control shoulder motion because he doesn't have as much. And then he can put 85% into the bar, right? So potentially more force capability by individual. So ultimately, you're going to lose stuff. So here's what this means, Ben, is that to keep someone comfortable. I'm not saying healthy, okay? Because we're dealing with some. I mean, powerlifting is just one of those activities that creates a lot of wear and tear on the system, right? But anything that we do that preserves adaptability can be interference to the performance. And so that's kind of what you're asking me. It's like how do I not interfere and keep these people comfortable? And I would have to say that at some point in time, you might not be able to, depending on what their choices are. Like they get to make those decisions as to how far they want to take this kind of a thing. The way that you try to manage this is you insert a certain amount of non-bilateral symmetrical activities that would produce turning capability. So that's what we're talking about. It's like the ability to maintain the ability to turn is what maintains the adaptability in the system, because our physical structure is designed to produce those turns. A squat and a bench press and a deadlift are specifically designed not to turn. The better I get at not turning, the better I get at the lifts, but I also sacrifice adaptability because my adaptability is within the turning. Okay. So you're always playing that game of like, how much can I maintain and not interfere? Can I keep my numbers going up? But at some point in time, and this is what we're talking about, genetic potentials, right? It's like, how much can you squeeze? How much muscle mass can you acquire? So more muscle mass is just more squeeze. Is that fair? Right? We put more stuff into a confined space, and then that increases the intramuscular pressure. That intramuscular pressure squeezes the bejesus out of the system, and then that allows us to lift more weight, because what we can do is we can take a column of water and squeeze it tighter and tighter and tighter. That's basically what lifting is, right? And then that allows us to put more pressure behind that fluid, and that's what lifts the weight. It's the water that lifts the weight. Okay. But like I said, in that process, we're going to take away something. Right? I have shifted resources so far in one direction that I will sacrifice. How much can you put in without creating interference? I don't know. It's a process, Ben. Right? You do stuff, you see what happens, and then you do more stuff.
Right, because the threshold of what you would consider that point at which someone is moving into their patterns that would feed their powerlifting performance is sometimes difficult to find, right? Because you could give someone, a split squat, and you could put a dumbbell in the contralateral hand to try to restore like internal rotation or something like that. And one person, it could work totally well with the same relative load, but others, it could be a total disaster.
Yes.
Yeah.
Welcome to coaching.
Yeah. So then sort of
nice if it was predictable, but it's just not. So you're always running an experiment.
Right.
You've done programming to see these outcomes, and you say, oh man, it's like I gave somebody this one strategy to work on. It did great, and numbers went up, and everybody's all happy. And I tried to utilize the same strategy with somebody else, and it just didn't work, either not as well, or it became interference.
Right. Yeah. And it also, I have tried in the past to use like key performance indicators for range of motion. So, is this person's straight leg raise? Is it at least 50 degrees? But, I'll see people who have a straight leg raise that's just like terrible, and they're totally pain free, and it's totally fine.
Sure.
So at a certain point, it's like the physiological norms almost seem like a bit arbitrary when it comes down to the individual level.
So let's change the perspective on that just a little bit. Let's not call them norms. Norm implies normal. Let's call it average.
Okay.
Let's call them averages from now on. Because norm is idiosyncratic. Like normal for one person is not normal for someone else. Physical structure determines what your capabilities will be. Okay, that's why certain structures are ideal for certain activities. Watch the Olympics on TV and watch the swimming. And before they start the race and they introduce everybody that's on the blocks, right? They all look exactly the same. Like their body types are exactly the same, because that body type is ideal for swimming. The only way you can tell them apart is the color of their caps, right? And so everybody's movement is idiosyncratic. That's why I'm such a stickler about remaining process oriented. It's like, oh, I want this guy to have more, to use a term, shoulder flexion. Guess what? He might not have it ever, because his physical structure does not lend it to having that. Can he reach overhead? Yes. How does he do it compared to someone else? Right? And again, let's use the Olympic swimmer example. Does an Olympic swimmer reach overhead the same way as a 5'10", 310-pound strongman? Probably not. Okay. It doesn't mean that they both can achieve a similar task. It just means that the way that they're going to do it is going to be dependent on their physical structure. So again, I encourage you to look at this stuff from an idiosyncratic standpoint. Yes, we have generalities that we can use to describe things, but ultimately, what someone is capable of is not the same thing that someone else is capable of. So we are making comparisons to an average, right? Is a 90-degree straight leg raise best for increasing your back squat? For someone, maybe it is representative of that. For someone else, maybe not.
Okay. Yeah.
And again, I sound like a broken record some days, but that's why this job is hard, because you're dealing with individuals. We have similarities that can guide us, but ultimately, when you're working with someone, you have to take into consideration their individual capabilities.
So, kind of shifting topics a little bit. Last week we talked about the bench press, and a lot of people that I work with are really, really used to squeezing their backs as much as they can and getting into this really, really strong arch. And obviously that's a strong strategy. And a lot of high level lifters encourage people to grow their back and those kinds of things. But a lot of times people I'll work with will experience shoulder issues when they are trying to squeeze their backs that much, which makes total sense to me. But instead of implementing some sort of corrective exercise, what I'll do is just tell people to get into like more of a passively spinally extended, traditionally extended position, where they are still in this arch, but they're not trying to squeeze their scaps back. They're not trying to squeeze them down. Sure. And a lot of times this clears up a lot of issues pretty quickly. So
yes,
I was thinking about this in relation to our conversation, and I was thinking about if we just use rib cage and humerus, for example, right? Or rib cage or scapula and humerus, for example, when we are not cueing ourselves to squeeze that same way, is what we're doing really just increasing relative motion? Okay.
You're making space. Okay. So let's use a muscle as a representation of this. When I contract a muscle, intramuscular pressure increases because I'm squeezing it down. I'm trying to make it into a smaller space, if you will. Now it does get wider. Okay. So I get that part. And then we're actually altering the connective tissue behaviors. But we're trying to reduce the amount of space that's available to move. So once again, we go back to the initial example. Where it's like we're trying to minimize some of this adaptability. So the squeezing that you're talking about is the compressive strategy of using the muscles themselves to create the pressure change. But if I eccentrically orient a certain degree of muscle, what that does is it allows expansion so that it increases the space around me that I can move into. So you just gave them external rotation space to access a position, and then they're going to produce internal rotation a little bit differently from that position. And that might be all that they needed in regards to relative motions, adaptability, to reduce the compressive strategies that typically will elicit some form of symptom like pain. So it's not a bad strategy. It's not a bad strategy as far as the acquisition of position and movement. But again, if we're talking about maximum load, that could be interference. But again, you have to follow the process, right? So maybe I can use that strategy periodically, but ultimately, again, from a performance perspective, the end game in regards to force production is going to be how much pressure can I create? Because it's that pressure on the fluid volume that lifts the weight.
Now, do you think there is an equivalent for the squat and deadlift of this example?
There's no real difference in concept, right? The shapes are a little bit different, right? But ultimately, it's going to be the exact same concept, right? Do you arch when you squat?
I mean, not a ridiculous amount now.
Okay, so I don't know how to measure a ridiculous amount. But conceptually speaking, yes, you do, right?
Yes.
Yeah. You wouldn't use a rounded back position to try to get a maximum effort squat, right?
Right. Hopefully.
And you wouldn't do the same thing for deadlift because again, those strategies create expansion, which is creating space for movement, not force into the ground. So any expansion that you create is movement away from the ground. Movement away from the ground doesn't allow me to push into the ground. So when you're bench pressing, your back is pushing into the bench, right? When you're squatting and deadlift, your feet are pushing into the ground. Anything that I do from an external rotation perspective is to acquire a position to allow me to complete the activity as desired. So you ever notice that like the longer somebody lifts, the more they shift towards like a sumo presentation?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, there's a reason for that, because that's where external rotation is, because I got to get down and get the bar, right? I got to start from somewhere. So there's a certain technique that I have to use to perform the lift. So there's a tendency, and not for everyone by any stretch of the imagination, but there's a tendency for guys to slowly move their feet out farther and farther because they're compressing more and more, and external rotation gets farther and farther out that way, and it becomes smaller and smaller for me to acquire, right? So the principle is applied across the board, because the end goal is force production. How do you produce force? I squeeze. Based on what we would call bench, squat, and deadlift, right? There are certain positions that you have to acquire to make it an official lift, if you will. And so that's the shape I need to be able to acquire. But the principle is the same.
Okay. Do we have time?
I'll give you 4 minutes. How about that? Is that fair?
Thank you. Yes, thank you. I appreciate it.
See, this is the benefit of the last call of the day. See, now I'm going to get a bunch of requests. Can I be the last call of the day? No. It's all luck of the draw. It's like when you came through, it's like, okay, Ben's going to be the last call again. There you go. All right,
go
ahead.
There are going to be some suspicious people, but
yes, I know. Well, as long as you keep paying me, I will keep giving you the last call of the day.
Okay. Yeah. So then I can imagine that if we take this idea and we sort of lateralize the thinking towards like, what are the external constraints that can also help us, achieve this expansion under load, you could consider like using a heel elevation, something like a heel elevation to create that expansion somewhere else.
Correct.
Which is why people can ultimately hit depth maybe a little bit more easily.
Of course. But you're sacrificing force production, because any element of ER that I add to the position of maximum propulsion. All right. So max P is the point where somebody can apply the greatest force into the ground.
Right.
Your force into the ground determines what you can actually lift upward, right? So that's max propulsion. Mm-hmm. That is a point in time. It is a singular, infinitesimally small point in time, okay? Any deviation in either direction. So if I go to early propulsion or I go to late propulsion, I'm moving towards external rotation. That allows me movement capability, but it immediately reduces my force production capabilities. So there's, like I said, if you could get to max P, here's the problem with max P. You can't move.
Mm-hmm.
Time stops. Like literally, time stops. Max force, but no time. So therefore, there's no movement. So if I'm going to execute a squat, bench, or deadlift, there is a certain degree of movement that I need to demonstrate. Otherwise, you don't get your 3 white lights, right? Okay. You ever see a guy go too shallow on a squat and he gets red lighted?
Yep.
Okay. So what happened? Too much pressure, can't move. Right? Squat suit too tight, wraps too tight, belt too tight. Or his own self-generated force production is so high that he can't move.
Right.
Okay?
No gradient.
No, there you go. Okay, so you totally picked the word right out of my head here. It's like that distance away from max P is my gradient.
Yeah.
If there's no gradient, there's no movement. But if the gradient's too big, bigger reduction in force output. You see it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So powerlifting is like, how small can I make this gradient? Still get enough movement, right? That I can still produce my maximum force. And then eventually at some point in time, there is a genetic limit.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to hit it. right? Hopefully, I mean, that ultimate, I mean, you're not going to increase force production forever. Everybody's going to have some sort of limit. You're going to break, or you're just going to top out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Not everybody gets to squat a grand.
Yeah.
Unfortunately. Well, I don't know. I don't know if it's unfortunate or fortunately under many circumstances.
Yeah.
Was that helpful?
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome. Really insightful.
Excellent. Great questions, Ben.
Thank you for another call.
Enjoy the rest of your weekend, man. I'll see you.
Thank you. You too.
You're welcome.